you'll only have to tape half tonight anyway, because
Okay.
the video was not really capable or whatever.
All right.
Thank you. Before I forget, and I may mention it again tonight, but I want to make a change in the schedule next week. I am going to take Thursday, a week from tonight, off. So I want to move Thursday's class next week to Tuesday and basically cancel Tuesday's subject matter, but we won't have class a week from tonight. I'll confirm that in here on Tuesday night. As I mentioned to you before, there's one piece of the class that has nothing to do with the state exam whatsoever, and I think I weaved that in already. And there's some materials either already posted in the shell, or I'll make sure they're all posted up online. The class I'm going to just kill off is the session where we would just talk about careers in real estate. We've done a fair amount of that already, and you can talk to me about that all you want. There's no questions on the final. There's no questions at the state exam about it. And the material that I will post it online are articles, and I think there's a color brochure from the Institute of Real Estate Management, a few other things like that. But I've got some things I got to catch up on, and so as soon as I get it confirmed by the college, I won't be here a week again, Thursday night next week, but I want to cover the material on Thursday night, so we'll move that to Tuesday night, which I think means we're going to do fair housing on Tuesday. The PowerPoint slides, as one of you noticed, aren't up after tonight, so this weekend I'll work on putting up the slides for 21, 22, and 23, and I'll get them up as soon as I can. They may or may not be up much before class. It depends upon how my schedule works out. Also, with Chapter 21 Fair Housing video, a Fair Housing section, there's an 18-minute video that is posted online. If you watch it beforehand, great, but there's a real good chance we're just going to watch that in class anyway. I like to use case studies to talk a little bit about fair housing, because it's really an important area that for a lot of us, we don't live it, we don't see it, and it would be easy to ignore, but it's still a huge problem, and I expect it to be for a long time in residential real estate. And the video that's up online is actually, it's sort of marketing propaganda by an Ohio law firm, but it's fairly softly done in that regard, and so 95% of it is really all about the case. And it's a very interesting case in that it's the kind of thing that if you don't hear the story, you would never believe that kind of thing has recently happened, or that it would even be a fair housing kind of thing, because it's not a denial of housing case like you might think, where somebody who's a minority or whatever goes to a landlord who simply says, no, we're not going to rent you. It's not that kind of a case at all, yet it's kind of a classic large-scale fair housing kind of thing that does happen. So anyway, if you have time to watch it, great, but don't worry about it, because we'll probably just watch it in class. It's just fascinating. To me, it's worth seeing a couple of times. It's just hard to believe. So again, for Tuesday night, read chapter 21. We may get to chapters 21 and 22 then. But 22 is really simple. It's probably 30 to 45 minutes tops, and it's not terribly complex. So if you've got time to read them both, great, but we'll just get through fair housing, and then if we have a chance to get into environmental, we will. Again, that's on for Tuesday night. So guess what I got in the mail today, boys and girls? I got a "we're leaving early" letter from the state of Illinois. Their large space, the one that they have that's 22% of the building, they're leaving in September. Picked it up in certified mail today at the post office. I'm so excited. So if you're like concealed carry, just shoot me in the parking lot after class. I have no idea what I'm going to do about that, but it's very interesting. And it's been an interesting week regarding the property, because and I'm bringing this up not just because I want to share the experience, but because it kind of relates to zoning and property management and all this kind of stuff we've been talking about. But I sent a letter to the partners yesterday. I don't have to. One of the advantages and one of the reasons that we spend a little bit of time going over corporate entities and things in Chapter 8 is because I live in that world, again, and different business organizations and structures have different rules and requirements. So with a partnership, there's no obligation for an annual meeting, and I don't owe the limited partners in this partnership anything. I don't ever have to send them money. I don't ever have to send them a letter. I don't have to tell them anything about what's going on the property. If they call me and ask me what's happening or if they're ever going to get money, I could hang up on them and there's nothing legally they could do. But every year, I've made the point of sending out a partnership letter. And I have, I think, 4 or 5 attorneys who are partners, a couple of doctors. You know, a lot of these deals tend to be high net worth individuals. And then quite a few family members and some other people who knew the family at the time when we were more actively in the real estate development business. So I send these letters out, and I get a lot of calls around this time of year also saying, where's our K-1s, which is a tax form you have to have. And so when I got the tax stuff back over the weekend, literally like after midnight Sunday night, I realized, oh, we made a lot of money last year, partly because the older a building gets, the less depreciation expense you have to write off your income. And I've been, as I probably mentioned to you, a lot kind of conserving cash. When you conserve cash and you're not making capital improvements or doing as much maintenance, your expenses aren't as high, so you have more taxable income. And I have partners who are in their 80s. I mean, everybody there's 18, maybe 17 partners, including myself. I'm not quite sure. I'm the second youngest. Only my half-sister is younger than me, and she inherited her interest. So, you know, for everybody else, they're much older, and I think we've lost 4 partners over the years since I've been managing the property, 1 before and 3 since. And so for some of these people, this disposable income tax is a very sensitive issue. So I decided, okay, I should hurry up and send them a distribution to cover their tax liability, so they have that. So here I cut loose $40,000 in cash, which would today feel much better if we still had, if it wasn't all sitting in the mail on the way to people's homes. And I sent them an update letter saying, you know, Jan, nothing really big has happened since last year. I'll write to you again next year. And then today, the world has kind of turned on its head. And that's happened to me before, where I'll write a letter and within days, some major thing, good or bad, will happen on the property. So, we'll see. It's very short. It's maybe 3 paragraphs with no more than 1 or 2 sentences each. It invokes a clause of release, and that's it. So, yay for Governor Rauner and writing the financial ship of the state. Make no mistake about it. We will fix things, and it will be done on the backs of people like you and me. All right, so tonight we're talking about real estate development, and that's really a lot about what this chapter is about. Zoning fits into this, land use controls, lots of other things that relate to this. There are really only probably a couple of questions that are likely to come up on your final exam or a state exam out of this chapter. There's a lot more material on these slides. I think this is a great subject area. I'd be happy to teach whole courses on nothing but real estate development. This is where the money is in real estate. If you're looking for where are the biggest dollars, it's to be a real estate developer, without question. That's how people like Donald Trump and John Buck and people like that make the big dollars. It's through real estate development. Brokers can do well, particularly, exceptionally well if you have good years in commercial real estate, but being the investor or the developer, that's where the money really is. And not just necessarily in flipping houses, though you can make money doing that. In big deals is where the big money is, of course. So we've talked about some kinds of private restrictions and land use controls here. We've looked at CC&Rs back in chapter 7. We looked at them in the deeds, right? That's those published restrictions that the subdivisions have. You can't have a junk car in the yard. You can't have an external TV antenna tower. You can't have an operating radio station in your house. You can't hang your laundry out to dry. Those are the CC&Rs that are recorded against the property, put in place by the developer initially to maintain the quality of the property over the long haul. It's a selling feature. We looked at the defeasible fees also in chapter 7. Easements, of course, we talked about in chapter 7. And something we haven't mentioned, and I don't think the text mentions, and I don't know if you really need to know it or not, but there is also the possibility of something called an equitable servitude. And what an equitable servitude is a contract between parties, one of whom is a current landowner, that does the same thing as these other things, places some current and probably future restriction on the property. So just trying to think of an example of this, having been involved as a developer with some small pieces of property, it's not at all unusual. In fact, I'll give you an example, a specific example. Out in New York, out by Fox Valley, there's a small motel right next to what used to be a Ponderosa restaurant on New York Street. company I oversee now developed that years ago. And that motel, which was originally a Comfort Inn or whatever, when they bought that piece of property, most of the land right around it on that side was undeveloped, and they wanted us to agree, we owned another 70-some acres, that we would not sell any of the rest of our land for any other hospitality use. So there's a contract signed then between them and between us. It makes sense to record it against the property, because if you don't record it, an equitable servitude is not binding on future owners, because future owners have to have notice. So they, it could be recorded anywhere against that rest of those parcels of ours, or their parcel, or whatever. And then anybody else who buys that land anytime into the future would theoretically be prohibited from ever building a hotel or motel on any of those other properties, even though there was only ever originally a contract between the original hotel builder, buyer, developer, whatever, and us, the landowners. That's how an equitable servitude would work. So again, it's a contract between the parties. You would want to record it, because again, you have to give notice. It's just another way to restrict rights for, not so much for current, but for future property owners done right. And again, I don't know that you get a question about equitable servitudes necessarily at the state exam, but it is a possible way to do some of these things. Public restrictions, again, we talked about eminent domain, right? The government's right to take your property for a public use or benefit. Police powers, we'll talk about again here a little bit now this evening in a little bit greater detail. So, with building and zoning, these are the great police powers that municipalities and counties have. Theoretically, these things rest with the state, but the state passes all that down to the local level. There are some federal and state building code laws, ADA, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Fair Housing Act, those affect building codes locally, but they're national statutes. They're not really codes, but they affect the local codes. And the state has its own, say, accessibility code and that kind of thing as well. And then, of course, zoning. What can you do with the property? And we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. So these are kind of a broader range of ways in which we can control what happens with land. And it's important to understand this, because as Americans, how do we tend to think? Well, we're private citizens, we have rights, freedom, and all that stuff, and we have far fewer freedoms than we can possibly imagine. You spend the rest of your life writing down all the things you are not free to do. Public ownership of real estate also controls it for a particular use. We talked about earlier, the largest landowner in the country by acreage is the federal government. That probably will remain that way forever. State governments, own a lot of property and dictate what they're going to do with certain things. Although the state of Illinois, as I mentioned the other night, may be selling the Thompson Center and other excess properties they have to unload them because we need cash. And all of these other types of uses will dictate what happens with properties. And governments can own land long-term, or they can have temporary ownership of it. Take something back through a sheet, for example, and then put it back on the market, or end up with it at the scavenger sale or forfeiture sale, through the tax sale or something, and end up with it temporarily. Just but those things have an impact on what happens with property, simply because the government owns it. It's not always in private hands. Land is always owned, but not always privately. All right, basic Illinois civics lesson, and this may have come up when we talked about transfer taxes, but our third constitution in the state of Illinois, which was chartered in 1970, creates home rule rights for any municipality or county in the state of Illinois with greater than 25,000 population. Which means that if you live in a municipality with 25,000 or more citizens, you can create your own ordinances that tax your citizens. Hence the ability of municipalities like Oswego and Batavia, once they hit 25,000 citizens, they could institute transfer taxes. Without that, they cannot do so. So, most municipalities are then also free to enact whatever kinds of land use restriction laws and building codes and ordinances, whatever. If they don't have home rule, entities like that may need to go to the state in order to get enabling statutes passed, and you can only imagine how hard it is to get the state to do anything. So really, tiny towns and villages can't control their destiny nearly as well as places with populations of greater than 25,000 people. In cases where municipalities and counties are in conflict with one another, it's important to understand that in land use, the municipality will take precedence. So an example of this is if you have property that's in the county, not incorporated within a municipality, but if that property is inside of the municipality's 20-year master plan for being annexed and rezoned and developed, when the owner of that property that's not inside the city goes to the county to try and get a building permit, the county will decline and say, go see the village. Because they recognize that the village still has rights over that property that's superior to theirs, even though it's not in the city at that time. Now, what happens in that case is that the municipality can't really influence what happens on that property directly. They do it kind of through the county's unwillingness to rezone the property or to allow building permits to go that wouldn't later be in conformity with the city's plans. But the municipality and the property owner would have to sit down and talk about an annexation agreement, an agreement to annex that property and have it fall under the city's control and all that sort of thing. Now, the county doesn't have to say no, but in any case, if there's any conflict or they think it won't fit, the county has the right to just say no because we want this to fit with Sugar Grove's future plans.
I'm assuming that everyone has access to those.
Yeah, like the master plan and things like that. It's all public record. Some towns you can find it online. In some cases, you still have to walk into City Hall and buy from them, or get access to it and pay for copies or whatever you want to get. Yeah, and it's a little bit different department name. Building and zoning in one place, community development in another. So you kind of have to feel your way around as far as where you're going to get it. Yeah, that's all public record. All right, so in that idea of trying to stay in conformity with the city's master plan or comprehensive plan, every municipality of any size that's trying to create something for itself will have a master plan or comprehensive plan. That's the basic idea. In fact, if you go back to when we may have talked earlier, very early in the class, about graduate education in real estate on the very first night, one of the more common areas of study within the realm of real estate is something called urban planning or urban and regional planning, that kind of thing. And that sort of land planning, which is a little bit like architecture, but also just kind of teaches the layout of what do you want where do you want your green space, where do you want your businesses, where do you want your residences, and kind of planning the city. That's what happens when you go to municipalities and counties and stuff today. They employ well-educated, sometimes with all the way up to a doctorate in their field, and the whole idea is to make the city the best quality of life. And that happens as part of this land planning process, hence the master plan or comprehensive plan. Occasionally you'll find a city that is in flux. They'll say, well, we're in the process of redoing this and it might be up in the air for a year or two. Or you can find areas within a master plan that they know won't work because what they have there is 20 years old, things have changed too much, and in the meantime they're going to kind of feel their way through it with whoever proposes a new change. But given a perfect set of circumstances, they'll have a well laid out master plan that you can look at, the zoning map basically, and look at the master plan and say, all of these properties within here, does the current zoning what the future zoning is? Because if you want to change the use of a property, you need to know what's the city's view. Do they want it to stay what it is? Do they want it to become something else? If they do they want it to become the same something else that I want it to be? There are all kinds of combinations on that possibility. Examples of that, if you're familiar, again, to go back out and talk about Fox Valley, the two most recent housing developments immediately to the north of the mall. One was done by Wiseman Hughes, who's out of business, and now it's the plaza on New York's being finished up by M&I Homes. And the other is over on Liberty, and it's townhouses built by Ryland. I think they've gone back in to finish up that development today. That whole piece of property, that enormous piece of property from 59 all the way, almost all the way to Commons Drive, and from New York to Liberty, at one point in time was all owned by one family, and it was called the farm. You could go there up until maybe 10 years ago and buy lettuce and other kinds of things on their farm stands on those properties. Meyer went in, of course, first, then some of their outlots were developed, but the land behind Meyer to the west and from Liberty to New York remained undeveloped for many years. And it remained undeveloped because it had been zoned industrial. Because Aurora was a manufacturing base, and that's what you would put in there, right? You would put in some kind of manufacturing or industry. Well, decades later, I was marketing a piece of property on Commons Drive, so just to the west of the farm, and went to the city and said, look, we got this 5.5 acre piece. It's zoned manufacturing. That's not going to happen. Your master plan says, you know, something else, and we've got this other kind of use. What do you want to do? And their response was, we'll pretty much take any business use you bring us. Because at that point in time, you had the post office, which had been developed there, the postal sorting facility. There was a restaurant, the motel I mentioned. There was a daycare center. There's the entire industrial development that's there, but it's all fairly kind of light development. And then you had Meyer and all the retail along 59 and the mall. And so you had this mix of housing, you know, multifamily housing and all this weird kind of odd development. So in that case, the plan has to change. And their plan was 20 to 30 years old and out of date, and they knew it. And eventually, those two huge parcels both went before the city, and they allowed them to be done as residential. Now, it's helpful to know probably that different land uses have different values, and the least expensive land, assuming it can even be used for this, is agricultural land. Land that could be even cheaper than that is land that can't even be used for agriculture. Maybe because, you know, it's restricted in some way, or you know, it's too low, or, you know, it's going to be taken by the county forest preserve district and be used for, you know, forest land or parkland or something. But that, you know, land that's agriculture could be made worth a lot more money by rezoning it to almost anything else. Business types, you know, I've talked about office and retail as being different. Industry, again, a wide range of use of properties. And then within residential, very different land values for single family zoning versus multifamily. When you get into residential, the greater the density, the greater the number of housing units in general, creates a higher land value. All right, so when they look at this comprehensive plan, they have to look at things like, what do we expect the population to do in our city? Is it going to be growing? Is it going to be declining? You know, what are our current and future needs? And also what businesses are moving in and what businesses are moving out. It's constantly in flux. That wasn't the intent, but, you know, the country now, particularly where we are here, is a lot different today than it would have been predicted to have been 40 years ago. We would have expected to have factories all up and down 47 and everywhere if you made this plan 40 years ago. Just, you know, not the case. So, you know, kind of look at where things are going, what's happening, what's changing, and try and predict the future. Not only that the future that you think is going to happen, but the future that you want. That's all part of this planning process. You know, what do we want in our community? And not only what do we want, but where do we want it? You know, where do you want your green space? You want it along the river? You want it along the bike paths? You want it inside of subdivisions? You know, do you want really large lots where people have a lot of private land ownership? We'll look at a few plat maps here in a little bit. Or do you want much smaller lots where the same subdivision has a lot more open green space that's open to the community? I once attended a zoning meeting where one of the City of Aurora aldermen made this public statement that schools and churches are what do you say, are a blight to our neighborhood, something like that. And everybody in the room went dead silent. They're like, what? Is he ever like planning to run for election again or whatever? Well, what he was talking about was a rezoning where there was a private school in the center of a subdivision. In fact, it's called the Fox Valley Montessori School, and it's, you take the huge area that's between Indian Trail and Illinois, and then between Randall and Elmwood. That whole block of residential property there has this, what's now probably about a 15,000 square foot private school in the middle of it, and everything else is all just residences. And his point was, schools don't belong in some place like that. They belong on Illinois, or on Indian Trail, or on Randall, or on Elmwood. But it didn't sound like that at the time that he said it. And so, you know, nothing wrong with having the schools, but where do you want to put them? Put them somewhere where the buses aren't driving, you know, in and amongst the houses. where you don't have to worry about your 6-year-old walking to school and whether some, buddy who's in a rush to drop their kid off at school or pick them up isn't gonna see them when they're crossing the street in the rain. So, that's all part of this urban planning process. What do you wanna put where, and how do you wanna lay it out? And it can be frustrating when you're the property owner or the developer or the broker trying to see this thing through and make it happen, but there's usually a legitimate, logical reason for why the village or the county is trying to do what they're trying to do. So zoning's been around for a while. It's about a century old, and zoning really came about in part because of this notion that, hey, this is America, we're free, we can do whatever we want. And pretty soon you end up with an adult bookstore across the street from your elementary school. So how do you regulate that kind of thing? The city of New York and a few others began to realize we really want to restrict what can be placed where. So they just started passing laws carving the cities up into zones. The idea that in this area you can do this, in this area you cannot, but you can do this instead. And it seemed to work reasonably well, but they would get pushback every time anybody would want to do something, and the city would say, no, you can't. And as I mentioned, different zoning uses creates different values. So the first litigation that went all the way to the US Supreme Court were private landowners saying, hang on, that's a taking, that's eminent domain. You've taken away some of my value by saying, I used to be able to build an office building there, but now I can only build a 3-flat or something. That's going to restrict what I can do. And ultimately, the US Supreme Court said, no, that's in the health, safety, well-being, best interest of the public in general, and we're going to allow that to stand. So you can't fight City Hall on something like zoning unless you've got a better argument. So, my advice to anybody who's a potential developer or broker who's involved in this kind of deal, or any investor looking at land, please think of it this way. Don't fight City Hall, find a way to negotiate with them. They don't really want to fight you either, and they may be willing to undertake certain trade-offs. I've seen, a development, for example, where one home builder went in and insisted things have got to be this way, got to be. 2 years later, they were walking away from a couple $100,000 in costs, in lost earnest money, in deposits, in engineering expenses, and whatever else they had spent, attorney's fees, to try and get a development done. And they just walked away from it because the deal they had made was contingent upon zoning and other things they were never going to get, because they tried to fight their way through City Hall. 9 months after that, that property closed without the contingencies being met, for more money with a different developer who decided they could, with some give and take, make it work. And so it all kinds of depends upon what you're trying to accomplish and how you want to accomplish it. Again, friendly and fair and reasonable tends to get more done and be better in the long run. So again, what does zoning affect? What can you do with the land? Permitted land use is kind of the technical way to look at it. How big is the lot? How big can the lot be? How far back are the properties set back? We've kind of looked at this idea, and we'll look at it a little bit more tonight. We saw it on the survey and wherever else. In some thinking, if you set buildings back farther, stuff looks more spacious. It's just more pleasing. You don't have houses crowding sidewalks, which are crowding streets. Sometimes the older, kind of run-down-ish looking neighborhoods are that way because of that kind of lack of planning when they were first put together. Everything is just kind of jammed in there. And the only way you could fix that would be to tear everything down and start over again, which takes really deep pockets, and developers aren't typically going to do that unless they know the demand's really high. Not when there's other virgin land available where they can go in and just sort of start from scratch. The type of a building, height, size, appearance. I grew up in Naperville, and until about 1980, you could not build anything in Naperville over 3 stories high. That was rule, that was law. In the city of Naperville, nothing higher than 3 stories. Anybody want to venture a guess why? Or anybody know why? Because until the late 70s or early 80s, the city of Naperville never owned a hook and ladder. They never owned a truck that could fight a fire higher than 30 feet. So anybody who wanted to build a higher than that structure was told no. The first mid-rise building constructed in the city of Naperville are apartments near Naperville Central High School on the river, close to the river, and the city still didn't have a hook and ladder, but this magic technology of fire sprinklers was installed in the building, and the city then approved this 8-story structure. And of course, you know, there are plenty of high structures in Naperville today. But that's what happens. Municipalities have overarching kind of budgetary concerns and constraints, and you may have some crazy thing like that that regulates what they're going to do. Another thing to know about with density, particularly for residential, is family density, particularly younger family density, has a huge impact on school districts. And if school districts don't have enough real estate tax revenue from commercial and industrial businesses, they typically are against high-density residential developments, which will give them more children, but not enough more tax revenue with which to educate those children. And this is one of the challenges you find in a district like East Aurora. Because we've lost a lot of that manufacturing base, and because East Aurora is very small geographically, it just doesn't have the economies of scale that you have in a larger district like West, or in much better financed districts like District 204, right across the county line, which borders District 131 to the east. You know, the tax rate in District 204 is crazy high, but they have, you know, people willing to pay it because of their $60, $70, $80 million high schools they have there. So this process of what can you do with land to make it worth more, and to cut deals, and to build stuff, and to, you know, generate fees and all that kind of stuff is relatively complex. It involves a lot of processes together, and the more you're involved in this, the more you see it, the more you'll see it makes sense. But it also, because of the complexity, sort of institutionalizes or makes permanent some of these problems. And that's a problem, like I say, again, particularly for East Aurora. It's hard to get out of that. Once you get a lot of lower socioeconomic folks all living in one area, having to work 2 and 3 jobs to pay the bills, to pay real estate taxes that are inadequate to educate kids to the, you know, to the way we would like to, then businesses don't want to move in there, and you know, because you have lower income folks, so the demographic doesn't work well, so you don't get the commercial development, which means you don't get the businesses paying taxes that provide 0 children. One of the reasons when Indian Trail was put through from Farnsworth to North Aurora Road, and, you know, connected Aurora all the way through to Naperville and DuPage County 7 or 8 years ago, whenever that was, the development that's there, that Carillon development, one of the reasons that active adult community is there is because it's residential, which made sense for the area, and because it means few to no children. All right, so here's just some designations, and you can go to different places. Different counties will have different nomenclature, different cities will have different nomenclature for the same thing. Remember, this is all very local, and so what a zoning designation is in Batavia will not match what it is in Geneva, will not match what it is in St. Charles. You have to learn the lingo, the jargon for each particular municipality. And that's what all these notes are about here. You don't have to know or memorize any of this for your state license, but I wanted to put it up here as just a real simple thing for you to be aware of, so that the first time you go through it, you don't think, okay, now I know exactly that R means residential. No, it doesn't know RI. And you might not have residential, you know, terminology. You might have something else depending upon, you know, where you're going to go. Very early in the course, we talked about planned unit developments. So it's possible to have to plan a development that's got these really broad zoning deals, where the municipality, for example, says, okay, we will agree that within this large tract of property, you could build 50,000 square feet of office, 300,000 square feet of retail, and 500 units of housing, and that's all the detail that's in there. But then the developer could basically submit plans, and as long as they meet within that in any way, shape, or form, it'll be accepted. So not every piece of property is zoned right down to the individual dwelling size. With a PUD, you end up getting this broader kind of view of what's going to happen with it, and then it gives the developer a chance to sort of pivot and make some changes. And it's also, I see I've got it down here, it should be maybe made later. It also makes it a little bit easier for a developer to then go in and say, well, we still want to do the 500 units of housing, but we want to give up 10,000 feet of the office and build 10,000 feet more of retail. And at that point, a city's probably willing to go along with it, especially if the thing's developed over some period of time. Some PUDs develop over periods of decades. It kind of depends upon what you're doing. So there's lots of different zoning types. A buffer zone is a way to sort of transition, so you might have your business areas here, for example, in one location, and before you go from business right to single family, you might have multifamily in between. So maybe you have industrial over here, then you have a business boulevard like here, like along a Randall Road or Galena or something, and then on the other side of that you have multifamily, and then on the other side of that you have single family, kind of transitioning from a harsher use to a more open for family kind of use. Zoning isn't always necessarily fair or pretty, but it works, and it is backed up by some element of science. Yeah, just some other types or basic ideas of zoning. I don't know if you really need to know any of those terms either. There's just a lot of different ways to do this, all of which is the same thing. How do we get what we want in the city when we want it? All right, so let's say that I got a piece of property and I want to rezone it or change the zoning. You can upzone, downzone, there's all sorts of different terminology. But I've got a piece of property that is zoned industrial, and now I want to turn it into residential. So what do I do? Well, in a case like that, as I've mentioned in a couple of cases tonight, pretty good chance city will go along with that because they'll look around and go, we don't have industrial, so what do we want? Something or nothing. We can wait forever for factories to come back, or we can just start developing the land we have and turning it into, multi-unit or single-family housing or whatever. So there's a permit application process for this, and it ends up going in front of staff first. Anytime you want to know, all right, we want to change the zoning, talk to the zoning staff, work with them. You may have heard from time to time about things like casinos and stuff in Illinois that they talk about. If you want to get a casino approved, you work with the staff because the gambling board, whatever, will listen to what the staff recommends some of the time. That's the same thing here. The hearing board, the zoning board of appeals, whatever it's called, is free to reject the staff recommendations, but it's not that common that they do that. And if the staff has really researched something and knows what the city is looking for, oftentimes having the staff on your side is what you want. If not, at a minimum, you need to have the alderman or the alderwoman on your team. You couldn't possibly get zoning change in the city of Chicago if the alderman of that ward doesn't want it. It'll never happen. It just won't happen. And I think Aurora is more and more like that all the time. Why is that? Because if you go to alderman in Ward 1 and say, I want to do this, and they say, I don't like that use, and you try and go to all the other aldermen to shove it down that particular alderman's throat, all the other aldermen are going to say, we would not be happy if aldermen from the first ward came to us and told us what to do in our area. So they won't do that. They will not typically force an alderman to do something that they don't want to do in their area. So again, you need to kind of have that sense of how that works, but first get staff recommendation if possible. Then the thing goes before the zoning board, maybe multiple meetings, depends upon what it is, who it is, where it is. I remember working with a real estate developer in Geneva many years ago, had the entire plan ready to go, needed to have this retail center open by Christmas. It was already May, and that's, hadn't broken ground. The site was developed, but hadn't broken ground on the building, and that's tough to get a retail center open in like 5 months to get tenants in before Thanksgiving. At the May zoning board meeting in Geneva, they were really busy, and at 10 o'clock, the guy hit the gavel and said, well, that's it, we'll see everybody next month. And this developer just about jumped out of his suit. He's like, well wait, what about my deal? He goes, well, we're out of time. So here's a developer, got a $4 million deal he's trying to get through, and the people on the zoning board are just saying, we're tired, we're going home, and we'll see you next month. The next day he said to me, I think I'm going to sue them. I said, for what? If you just sit on your hands, next month they're going to approve your deal first thing in the meeting. If you sue them, you might not get ahead forever. So you never know what you're going to run into or what the procedural process is, but these things happen. All right, so if you want to get it changed, modified, up zone, down zone, whatever, that's kind of the basic a part of the process, or the people you go to. There's more process we'll talk about. Well, what's this non-conforming use thing? And the basics of zoning here, and it's something like a non-conforming use, these are terms you're going to want to know for your exams. So non-conforming use is something that came first, this sort of archaic term of something being grandfathered, meaning it was there before the rule. So that Fox Valley Montessori School that I mentioned to you in Aurora had been unincorporated Kane County at one time. It's like an 800 North Commonwealth. And it was an old industrial building. If you think of the old factory buildings, kind of a buff-colored precast two-rib concrete building, it was ugly. But it was cheap, and it's what they threw up at the time to have this place to school their kids. And some years later, all of a sudden, the city annexed all that property, and housing was built all around it. So as long as they didn't touch that school, it could have stayed like that forever, because it was grandfathered. It was a legal, non-conforming use. Very rarely in zoning law do we push back in time and say, we're changing the zoning rules and we're going to make you do something that we should have made you do 30 years ago. That usually doesn't happen. So this idea of a non-conforming use, typically a legal non-conforming use, means it does not conform to the current zoning. But it's okay if it remains as is because you were there before the current zoning rule was. This is the way it's been on many places in Aurora, again, particularly on the Near East Side, where you've had, if you look like along Lincoln and stuff, there's some enormous houses up in that area where the people who first owned the mills and factories in town in the late 1800s built their ginormous houses that kind of looked down over the river in their industry and whatever. Well, by the 1960s, those people were all gone, the factories and things had all moved, and so those houses got bought up by investors who carved them up and made them 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 unit properties. They could do that then because there was no zoning that prohibited it. But once the city changed that zoning, what happened? As long as those places didn't make any changes, they could remain as legal non-conforming multi-units. But if they wanted to renovate them in a significant way that required a permit, the city could say no unless you downzone it and make it conform to our current zoning requirements.
This is not really.
No, go ahead.
Those are historic homes, correct?
Yeah, and some of them are. And now some of them that, first of all, Aurora has like 6 different historic districts, but some of them are actually specific historic properties because they were owned by well-known factory owners or influential people. Yeah, if you're in a historic district, that's similar to this, but even that's even different because all 6 historic districts in Aurora, for example, I think they all have different rules.
Yeah, because
Anybody here?
Like, my dad has to get like all these permits in order for them to do like some
Yeah.
type of construction roofing. It has to be the same color. And
Right.
It has to be like
And see, not every historic district has the same rule. So one historic district, for example, may not allow you, may restrict what windows you could use to replace
Yeah.
because they want to keep the same profile. Another district might say, not only do you have to keep the same profile, if you're taking out a wood window, you've got to replace it with a wood window. So
I think
it
it's
all.
good to know this because such a buyer, it's like, well.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to do
It's
something with your land, again, it's another way, historic districts are another way you're restricted from doing it. And again, under the guise of what's in the best interest of maintaining the integrity of the historic area. You cannot be put into a historic district originally without your permission. But once that property's in there, you probably will never get it out of there. So. All right, so that's the basic idea of being grandfathered. Again, if you don't want to change anything, not a problem, but once you want to change it, or if it burns down, you might not be able to rebuild it. Get the insurance proceeds, take the cash, and that's the end of it. You won't be able to rebuild it for what it was. Another way to look at modifying zoning is something called a conditional use permit. In fact, or special use permit. In fact, zoning categories will list what can be done there. So if you go like to Aurora at B3, it will list things like outside storage and mini storage warehouses and general business and all kinds of things that will be listed there. But there is not, for example, in the city of Aurora, a zoning category for mini storage warehouses. So if you want to develop a mini storage warehouse, which is fairly inexpensive to develop, and we have a lot of stuff, so it seems like there's a never-ending demand for these kinds of things, you could probably do that, but there's not a zoning class that automatically permits it, not one. Yet almost every zoning class permits it as a special use, which means what? No matter where you want to build your mini storage warehouse, you're going to need to get the zoning board's approval to issue a special use permit for that. So that's the kind of thing, that you're going to end up having to do. Special use permits can be restricted to that particular applicant. I'm pretty sure that what the Fox Valley Montessori School ended up getting was not a variance, but a special use permit because the zoning remained the same, and the zoning changes we were able to get through with the city, I was on the board at the time, were restricted to that school. So it's not like they could sell the school to some other entity or some other owner. It will always have to be run by that same nonprofit, or the whole thing goes up before the neighbors again for their approval and objection and all that kind of stuff. A variance can be where you actually have the right zoning, but there's something else wrong with the property. So an example of a variance need would be, for example, in town, Geneva, Batavia, there are a lot of those lots that are zoned for duplexes. A lot of the houses even that are used as single-family houses today, as I mentioned, I think in a previous class, are zoned for legal duplexes. Well, if you have a lot, a vacant lot, never been built on, that is zoned for a 2-unit, but the building code requires the lot to be 100 feet wide, and your lot is only 80 feet wide, it's zoned for it, but how do you do it when it doesn't meet the criteria that's required in the same zoning code for them? You apply for a variance. We're not looking to change the zoning. Board of Appeals here, we just want you to agree that 80 feet is wide enough for us to build this particular duplex on that particular lot. So if you get that variance, the zoning remains the same, but you're allowed to vary from that part of that particular case. Something like that. And again, the variances aren't owner specific, they transfer. You know, so that same use can stay there forever as long as it works. So again, those are common terms you are likely to see. Basic things, terms like zoning, special use permit, variances, and the zoning board of appeals, that basic idea. Now, when you want to have this change in use, kind of what I started on before, you end up having a hearing. And you've probably seen the signs around, these little plastic signs on the metal stakes. They just stick them into the subject property, it's a property that's the subject of the zoning hearing, and they send a mailer out to like property owners within 300 feet or 500 feet or whatever the municipal rules are, and may get this notice to say, you know, so-and-so is looking at rezoning their property. It's your invitation to show up at the meeting and say, hell no. No. You know, we don't want that here. This is where you get a chance as a neighboring property owner, whether it's commercial or residential, or what the relationship is, doesn't matter. You have the right to show up and object. In fact, any member of that municipality, any citizen has the right to show up and voice their disapproval. But the city council or the zoning board or whomever will pay the most attention to the neighboring property owners who are affected by things like lights that are now going to be on in the parking lot 24 hours a day, or a once vacant property now being developed and traffic is going to increase, or something like that that's significant enough to people to say we don't want that kind of thing. And so you have public notice. Again, it's the signs, it's the mailings, whatever, and then at the meeting, public comment. And then a decision will be made later. The staff will say we're for it, we're against it, whatever the deal is, and then all that stuff eventually will become determined. Maybe that night, maybe not. Sometimes those decisions are made right there at the meeting by the board, and sometimes they're made much later on, depending upon how much more investigation they want to do, or whether staff has to go back and research something or whatever. It is possible to get use changes put through relatively easily if they're very nominal, and if all the politicians are for it, then they sometimes will completely ignore what the population wants. In other cases, the population will kill a perfectly good deal, or so it will seem at the time. So, it varies depending upon circumstances, and my experience is I don't know that you ever know what you're going to get until you go through the process. All right, any other questions at all about zoning or looking at that idea of zoning? Part of the process of knowing you can do what you want to do with a piece of property is also knowing that you can get a building permit. Every municipality, like every municipality has its own zoning codes, or every county has its own zoning regs, they also have their own, in fact, the police power, their own building codes. Building codes are international in how they are developed, but ultimately it is up to each municipality or each local governing body when they adopt those new codes. So whatever you can do in Aurora has nothing to do with what you can do in North Aurora, has nothing to do with what you can do in Montgomery, has nothing to do with what you can do in Sugar Grove. Those are all completely separately governed entities. I swear, Aurora changes the law the instant the major code recommendations change. Aurora is Chicago-esque in my way of thinking in terms of difficulty to do business with, because you put somebody in a property in November, you go to put a similar tenant in January, and you find out that the code has changed. Because there's safety concern, a bigger population, they tend to adopt much faster. Other municipalities may not adopt at all. Plus, every disaster that happens in a given community, you can bet that that city council will change their ordinances to account for the possibility that that kind of thing might happen again in the future. So if you have a nightclub fire in Chicago, or you have porch collapses in Chicago, guess what city changes everything immediately? And then there's a ripple effect, and some of the surrounding suburbs will change things, and other communities may not. You can trace the history of building code modifications to the history of disasters. If you have a big enough fire and enough people die, the code will ripple across the entire country. If it tends to be more localized, it'll only be there. So even if you find out that Aurora has adopted the International Building Code from 2009, or whatever the latest code is that they've adopted, they might still have a whole bunch of local ordinances in addition to that, based upon their own specific experience. So again, if you're doing development, or you're working with builders, or people like that as a broker, the more you know about that specific municipality, the more likely you are to be able to give them a sense whether it's an easy place to build and develop, or whether it's a difficult place. A developer who's got an idea and a staff with limited time and the limited amount of financial resources wants to get a development in the ground because they make money based on fees and turning over units. And if it takes them 2 years to develop in community A, and they can develop in 9 months in community B, guess which one they want to develop? They want to go where they feel welcome and where they can get things through more easily. And again, that varies. Ultimately, once you go through and get your building permit and you're able to launch and do all this kind of stuff, you have a bunch of inspections that go on to make sure everything is done properly, but you're trying to get to the point of getting a CO, or a certificate of occupancy. No tenant, homeowner, owner-occupant, business owner, whatever, can move into their building without a certificate of occupancy. And by that, I mean you can move in physically. In fact, you have to. To get a certificate of occupancy for a commercial or industrial property, for example, it must be completely furnished or filled with equipment exactly how it's meant to operate. So you can't open an industrial, like a factory building, you can't get a certificate of occupancy until all the equipment is in place. You can't get a CO for an office building until the furniture is in place. The city comes out and sees an empty office, they'll walk away, and you got to get the tenant involved to get them to put their stuff in, because the city's looking for things like clearance and pathways and fire exits and how's all this stuff set up. So as the developer, for example, you might do everything exactly right, but your tenant's got something messed up and the CO gets delayed because the inspector goes, that's got to move and you can't have that there. But that's part of the process. So that's what you're looking for. Yeah, again, it takes a permit to occupy your own property or property you have leased, and you've got to go through that process. Part of what builders and developers have to go through on a regular basis. Again, if you specialize in commercial or more complex kind of things, you're used to seeing this. If you do property management, you live and die with this kind of thing. If you're talking about something other than multifamily or single family, because you're constantly moving tenants in and out, so there's a lot of this kind of thing interfacing with the municipality or the county to do. If you don't do that, you can be blissfully ignorant of most of this stuff. All right, any questions about any of that with building codes and zoning codes or any of the stuff we talked about until now? All right, a couple of things they talk about in the text. Subdividing, as we've talked about before, is somebody who buys property and carves it up into smaller pieces. So hence the idea of a subdivider. Around here, usually, not always, but usually anymore, you're seeing developers who come in and actually both subdivide the land and build the homes. A difference of that is like the lakes of Bliss Woods, for example, over here in Sugar Grove. That was a subdivider, a division of Inland Real Estate, I think, or some entity bought the land. Inland Broker did, I know that, bought the land, and then once the thing was subdivided, a bunch of builders bought the lots, and so you had a bunch of different builders in one development. But if you're talking about a Pulte or a KB Homes or Lennar or somebody like that, they're acting as the developer, where they're the subdivider and the builder of homes. They're doing the whole thing itself. So sometimes small builders pool their resources together, and a subdivider makes money simply by developing the land and selling off the lots and leaving, and all the lots get sold off to builders. But more frequently today, the model is one really big national scale or regional home builder who does the whole thing. Puts in the sewer, the water, the improvements, builds the houses, or whatever other stuff you're building on the land. Real estate developers usually have their own in-house expertise in one of these areas. So it's not at all uncommon to see somebody with experience in real estate brokerage. I mean, it doesn't happen to 1 out of 10 of us, but 1 out of 1,000 of us or whatever. If you're good enough real estate broker where you know leasing or sales or whatever, that's an important part of real estate development. And that may be enough to be able to figure out how to do a development. And then you hire the rest of this. My father was a contractor. He was a master's degree civil engineer. We had a construction company. 1970s, the construction company started acquiring land. Next thing you know, we're real estate developers. How did that happen? Well, we knew how to build it. All we had to do was hire an architect, somebody to design it, and you go to a lender to get the banking done, attorneys to help us figure out the rest of this, and an outside brokerage firm to do all the brokerage. So all we needed was that one area of expertise. You take somebody like Opus out of Minnesota. Opus does their own construction, their own design. They even have their own in-house construction people. They hire their own carpenters and other things. Very interesting. Or developers like Walsh today that are so big they do a lot of their own finance, and the guys who run it are attorneys. So you'll see developers have interesting architecture, interesting combination of skills. One I'm thinking of now that's done a lot of work on the lakefront recently, I'm trying to remember what the company name is, Magellan Development, is a partnership between a lawyer and an architect. So between that, they know pretty much, and they can hire everything else they need. So it's not a difficult thing to make the leap from real estate expert on one level to being a developer. And why aren't you a developer, in effect, if you buy a house, fix it up, and sell it to somebody? That's kind of a real estate developer. You're just doing rehabs. It's still the same thing on a smaller scale. If you can get good at flipping houses, then eventually you could figure out how to buy a vacant piece of property and build one. I've got a former student here. He's 25 years old, I think. One of my favorite students ever in the Intro to Entrepreneurship class that I teach. He left the class in the middle. I preach to those students that if you're serious about opening a business, what the hell are you doing sitting here? Get up, get out, go do it. Middle of the class, he just quit coming. I've known this kid since he was 6, seriously. And he comes back about 2 weeks left to go. He said, can I still finish the class? In that course, it was okay. But what he had done, he had launched a construction business. He's been doing remodeling, and he now hires enough people that I have some of his employees as students in my construction program here. And the reason I'm bringing him up is because he's bought a vacant lot, and they're going to build a house from scratch this summer. He's going to put it on the market and sell it. He goes from building garages and remodeling basements and fixing broken windows and builds himself enough of a base. And what's he doing now? He's a real estate developer. You can call it a home builder if you want, but if you buy the lot and you build it and you try and sell it, you're the developer. So that's a possibility for you all to think about, depending upon what you want to do in the future. My father and several of his fellow executives owned duplexes and other properties in Naperville that they bought together at various times, and one of the 3 of them eventually retired from the construction company and did nothing but owned and managed and operated real estate, some of which he sold to NIE here in Aurora many years ago before he passed, because that's what you can do. You can kind of shift from one of these to the other. All right. Looking still at kind of subdivision and how to do this kind of stuff. Again, to be able to buy a piece of property that needs to be subdivided, what are you going to do with it? You need to understand that first you're going to have a plan, put that plan in front of the board, get it approved locally. The term plat is basically a map or a survey or a site plan of what you expect to do with that property. I sold an 8-unit apartment building in Naperville a couple of years ago. And that 8-unit apartment building was actually sitting on 3 separate, distinct residential building lots, all of which mostly were zoned for 2 units. So it had gotten a variance like 40 some years ago, to turn that 6-unit qualified piece into 8. And why not? You didn't need you need all the driveways, or you need no garages or whatever. So the density seemed to make sense. But it was all done locally when that was done in the early 1970s. So you have a plat map. What is the site going to look like? Where is everything going to go, etc. And whatever other data you need to go, and all that stuff is looked at and is available to the city or whomever the staff are they need to look at. Now, in today's world, impact fees are a big part of subdivision plans. So before the bust, the village of Sugar Grove did something very interesting. Because a village like Sugar Grove has a huge problem with development. They don't have any money. If you go to the village of Sugar Grove and say, hey, I just bought 300 acres and I want to build, you know, whatever you're going to build 300 acres, I want to build 900 homes over the next X number of years, the village is going to go, that's nice. Where are you going to get the water and who's going to treat the shit that comes out of all these places? Really, I mean, how are they going to do that? I mean, in the older municipalities, they've got facilities. They have, you know, they can treat the stuff, they can deal with it, the infrastructure is there. So for the villages to come up with the money, instead of borrowing it and getting it back in taxes over the next 20 years, today they want the money up front. So Sugar Grove said, look, if you're going to do that here, that's great, but you're going to pay us money. So they came up with impact fees of like $30,000 a lot. So you take that 900 home subdivision that I'm throwing out and saying, for every lot, 30 grand has to go to the village. And that money then we could use to build the waste treatment facility and the drinking water facility so that you could then have that stuff in advance as opposed to having to float bonds and finance it and pay the interest, et cetera, over a long period of time. The problem is, once you do that, why would anybody build in your community if they can go to Elburn or unincorporated area or west side of Aurora and build where there are no or much smaller impact fees? So that's one of the reasons why, like Newman Homes in Naperville, who's of course long out of business now, but they had a big development slated for Sugar Grove that never broke ground because the impact fees hit right when they were planning on doing so, and they looked at that and went, we're done, it's not feasible. And I don't know if Sugar Grove has reversed that, but unless they do, I'm not sure you'll see residential development on any scale in Sugar Grove ever. Not in our lifetimes, really is what I'm saying. It's just too expensive. What is $30,000 per lot, meaning $40,000 per house, better about Sugar Grove than 3 miles away? Probably nothing. But that's a challenge for a lot of municipalities. Where's the money going to come from to build the infrastructure? As I think I may have mentioned earlier, if you look at real estate tax rates, my tax rate in Glen Ellen is less than what anybody has in here with the possible exception of Olga, I would bet, because she's up in Rockford. And that's because the infrastructure in Glen Ellen is old. Your infrastructure out here is newer, and means it was paid for more recently, meaning it's very high. So, that kind of thing shows up here as well. New construction, very expensive. And government's trying to figure out how do we deal with this. And St. Charles did something. St. Charles passed a moratorium. The idea of a moratorium is that no more development. I don't know, that was maybe in 2006 or something. So at that point in time, they were approving no new developments in St. Charles at all. Very highly desirable community, a place where a lot of developers would have loved to build homes. Well sought after and publicized school district. But I don't know what the deal is today, but that was 6, 07. They just said, we can't handle the growth. So no more, not until we get caught up. It happens. All right, looking at subdivision density, talking about this idea of residential, as I mentioned, brokers, landowners, developers, everybody in that part of the transaction wants to have greater density. This greater density means more transactions, means higher dollar volume, dollar value. Right? So, there's also a lot of different ways in which to lay out subdivisions. And sometimes you can negotiate a little bit higher density if you give in on the way in which a subdivision is designed. This density by itself is only a part of the equation. How big are the lots, for example? So under the standard old gridiron pattern, and you see this in Chicago where all the streets run north-south, and if you don't put up some kind of speed bumps or something, every street can become a through street. It's a terrible place to live in that regard, because people can't get up Cicero Avenue because it's blocked, so they'll go 1 block over and just drive up the residential side streets at 40 miles an hour, where sometimes you've got both sides blocked with cars. It can be a terrifying place to be a resident with kids, or annoying kind of a place to be. So today, this gridiron pattern, because of traffic issues, is largely frowned upon. Curvilinear system, think Boulder Hill, became the norm. The first time it was really ever used was in the 1940s in the Levittown development in New York. Levittown being like the prototypical subdivision, post-World War II subdivision, which used a lot of curvilinear streets to get away from this through traffic problem. and then you have clusters. And so let's take a look at these and see, I think I have some maps up here, so you can get a sense about what some different options look like. Again, you don't have to know or have memorized any of this stuff. I just want you to have a sense that just because there's a piece of property and just because it has a certain density and a certain zoning doesn't mean you have to lay it out the same way. There's lots of different ways to do the same thing. So here is a subdivision development. This is just something I pulled off of the internet, and it's just really kind of a site plan. You can see that there are two ways, I think, to get in and out of here. One is up here, and the other is over here on this side here. There's a double, entry and exit there, and a simpler entry and exit here. Otherwise, no other ways to get out. But there's a couple things. It gives you more lots, and it also limits ingress and egress, which means no easy through traffic, right? Maybe you can come in here and go up and go out that way. Even that is more through traffic-ish than what municipality might like. You can see that these lots take up all the room. There's a little bit of green space here, and you've got probably a swimming pool, clubhouse kind of thing. But this has become the sort of this typical standard subdivision layout, where everybody got as big a lot as possible, and you wanted those lots that backed up, to the trees or to open spaces or whatever, to give you that sense of privacy and that kind of thing. That may or may not be what people are doing today, again, depending upon what the municipalities are looking for. So again, if you download the slides and look at this, you'll see I've given you the description here, so it'll make you understand when you're looking at the pictures what you're looking at. The next two slides are showing you two different sets of properties in comparison layouts. So in this particular case on the top, you've got a lot of cul-de-sacs, and you have a street that comes in at this end and goes out at that end in one of two places. So this is kind of through traffic-ish right here, right? And again, there's no sort of public open space here. Everything is, pretty routine, rudimentary. Here now, you don't really have nearly as good a through traffic. You have hardly any cul-de-sacs, really one here and one little loop right here. And although you can come in here, you have to turn to get out there, and so it's much harder to get in and around and through. Same basic concept with a whole sort of different sort of feel. This is much more likely what a village is going to want to look at today. Although as we'll look at the next slide and comparing two different types, you'll see there's even greater demand for shared open space, and this is the whole idea of clustering, or in this case they're calling it a conservation subdivision. I think I pulled this off of the site for a development of an example from the state of Pennsylvania, showing here just a typical subdivision, large private lots, a little bit of green area, retention pond or whatever. But this is what they would prefer today: smaller lots, same density, smaller number of lots, and then this green space is open not just to the people who live in that community, but to everybody anywhere in that city. And so you've got these walking paths and trails that might connect to other walking paths and trails somewhere else. You've got all this wonderful green open space that gives the raccoon someplace to live, and the deer and whatever. So, I mean, same piece of property, but two completely different ways to look at it. This is the kind of thing that a lot of subdivision developers will go to the city and say, this is what we want, take it or leave it. And the city's trying to say, well, that's okay, but we're really looking for something more like this. And again, if you negotiate this, you might get a combination of the two. You might get some larger lots with some smaller lots, a combination of kind of conventional and clustering sort of a kind of arrangement. This isn't necessarily really clustering because they're not really together, but you could do that here where you came in and sort of had a circle and had places going off that circle and had much smaller lots. So what do you want? A big private yard or a smaller yard, less to take care of, but still access to all that open green space? Again, that sort of conservation area or clustering similarity to it is much more common how builders are tending today and how municipalities are trying to get things done. It's bragging rights. With all these lists about where's the best place in the country to live, you've got nothing to brag about in the upper left-hand corner. But in the lower right-hand corner, you've got all these walking paths. You've got all these quality of life things. You've got more public park space. Those things go on these sheets about the better quality of life. So that's what's really is part of what's driving, a small part, but it's part of what's driving it. All right, so back to our land use controls here. Looking at these restrictive covenants, again, they run with the land, and they establish what can be done in that subdivision really in perpetuity, although a homeowners association can change that. So if you want to be active on the HOA, find out what the bylaws say about changing something, and you can do it. And also, if a CC, if a covenant is not enforced, it will probably become unenforceable eventually. Case in point, somebody goes into a subdivision where one of the covenants is all the driveways have to be brick pavers or concrete. One lot was never built, they go in, they build it, they put an asphalt driveway in it, nobody says anything for 5 years. Now the older homes in there start needing new driveways, and somebody goes, hey, why do I have to have concrete or brick pavers? That's $15,000. I can pave over my current drive for $3 grand. They put an asphalt. If a neighbor would say you can't put an asphalt here, all they have to do is point to that 5 years of inaction by the board, take it to court, and the court will probably say, yeah, you voted to say you don't care when you didn't enforce your restriction for the first, for the people that put it in. So that's, the important thing with HOAs, either you're going to follow your own rules or you're not. If you fail to, you probably lose them.
Is there a certain time period my neighbor?
No, because it's case law, so it's, because that kind of thing isn't statutory. So it's usually looked at what's a reasonable amount of time, but that's up to the courts, as far as I know, So, but I would imagine it's a few years, not a decade. And frankly, some of these people probably really don't care about, so it kind of depends upon what the, what the issue is. I didn't mean to cut you off, if you wanted to talk more specifics, but that's kind of my experience, that it's really short. All right, so if we want to enforce that, if we want to go after that, it's important, this is kind of a simple thing to know and remember, a private restriction is enforced through private civil action. And private civil action means litigation eventually. If you can't get any redress or any remedy by the homeowners association putting pressure on whomever the other party is, then ultimately you're going to have to go to court. And when you're in court, you're seeking something called an injunction, or what they call injunctive relief, asking a court to order that other party to cease doing what they've been doing, or to not proceed with what you think they're about to do that would violate the covenants. So for 6 months, your neighbor's been hanging their laundry and their swimsuits out to dry on a towel rack, and for in the backyard, or on a line in the backyard, which violates the restrictions. And the HOA gives them notice in writing a couple of times, they won't do anything about it. So then the HOA can go to court and file a lawsuit, and the court can order them to stop. And if they still don't stop, then you can get the police involved to actually do something about it. Because it's a private civil matter, police can't come out and enforce subdivision restrictions. If once there's a court order involved, then they can. And there might be, it's possible that you could get financial damages depending upon the circumstance. You have to be able to prove those, but it is possible. All right, so here's an example for you to think about. And then I have on the next slide kind of an opposite example. So the question is up here, which takes priority? A zoning restriction or a private restriction? So here's the example I've given you. Here's this dotted line is showing you here that you're walking the dog in the subdivision, and there's there's one vacant lot here, and this, you can see by the way this house is now staked, where the orange spray paint is in the gravel and where the wood stakes are driven, that a house is going to be built in this exact location. And there's a 30-foot, and this is 20, this is maybe 27 feet behind whatever, off the street. And there's a 30-foot subdivision setback and a 25-foot local zoning setback. So which one of those is going to take priority? And the question also, if the following scenario is true, what do we do to stop the house construction? Before we actually answer that, let's go to the next slide, which looks remarkably the same, except I flipped the two on the bottom. So here's the original one with the subdivision being 30 feet and the local zoning, the municipality being 25 feet. And in the next slide, I've just flipped the two. Everything else about it's the same. 30-foot local zoning setback, 25-foot subdivision setback. So either scenario could be in play here. So then the question is, what do you do to stop construction here? And which one takes priority? Which one rules? Municipal or private? In both cases?
Whichever one is stricter.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the basic rule of thumb is, whichever one is more strict, and the reason for that is once you do that, you're really complying with both. Because that's really what you have to do. You have to comply with both. So as long as you comply with the more strict of the two, then you're complying with both, it's not a problem. Here, they're obviously in either slide, they're not complying with one or the other. So then the follow-on question is, all right, in these two different scenarios, they're obeying one but not the other. So and we flip those two situations. So where do you go? What do you do if they're violating the municipal zoning? If we go to the prior slide, I've got this right. They're meeting, in this case, they're meeting the zoning setback because it's farther back than that, but they're not meeting the subdivision setback. So what might it take to stop this house construction? It's a private restriction that they're not meeting. Go to court, get the homeowners association involved and file a lawsuit. Get an injunction to stop the construction. In the next case, where we flip it, you meet the subdivision setback, you don't meet the local zoning setback. Here, HOA has no standing because you're not in violation. So here, the local zoning officer should be able to come out or go to their building permit counterpart and just stop the whole process until it gets rectified. Now, in the case of here, where you've got this private restriction that is being violated, this is back to that case that I mentioned, of the pavement, how long you let it go. But in the case where you see this before it's built, and now you have the opportunity to stop it and you don't, and you let the construction get built and then you go, a court probably will not force them to cut the front 2, 3, 4, 5 feet of the house off. There's a principle under the law called laches, spelled L-A-C-H-E-S, if you've ever heard of this. And this idea of laches is that once you know of a violation of it like this, you have an affirmative duty to report it. And if you complain about it later and you failed to help these people or their builder mitigate the damages, you knew or should have known about this but did nothing about it, a court will probably no longer side with you and say you waived your right to enforce that restriction by your silence or your inaction. So once you see something like that, you really have to respond in a timely way. Otherwise, you'll find yourself possibly in a court explaining why you didn't care when it was most critical. And I'm not going to worry about this whole land sales disclosure stuff at the end of the chapter. If you want to read about that or memorize that, that's cool, but probably pretty meaningless for our purposes. Any questions at all about anything in this chapter? All right, well, let's take a break. Let's come back if you can at about 8 o'clock. I'm going to have a video queued up. What I want you to do, we've been talking a lot about Willis Tower, Sears Tower, whatever. I'm going to show about a 45 to 50-minute video kind of on the development, on the construction of that. And what I want you to do is kind of make some mental notes as to what the world was like in the early 1970s. And then we'll talk a little bit afterward what the area is like downtown Chicago around Sears Tower today to get an understanding of what real estate development can do or kind of impact it can have.